Chapter 30. Duncan was marching, accompanying him with 34 teenage boys and a one-armed goblin. Allowing Roptek to join them had caused some division among the boys. A group of them had been deeply untrusting of the goblin, which Duncan understood, and did not want anything to do with the goblins beyond leaving them for the wolves. Ben, with his fearsome one-eyed glare, had talked to them for hours, convincing them of how useful it would be to have a goblin on their side. He also talked a lot about how Roptek had always been different from the other goblins, treating them better. Most were inclined to agree with that sentiment, and eventually came to a grudging acceptance that Roptek could join them, for as long as he was useful. Together they marched. They now had a goblin that knew the land well, and could lead them directly to the training camp. Roptek told them that the farm where the cloned boys were grown from teeth taken by tooth goblins was not far from the training camps. Once the clones are taken from the blue realm and swapped for the real boys, the freshly kidnapped boys spent a few weeks having some basic training in using weapons and being a soldier in Umkrar's army. Then they went to war, to get hardened in battle. Roptek explained that the boys in the camp were a timid bunch, still very uncertain of everything, including how to hold a sword, so an attacking force of over 30 experienced soldiers should not have too many problems. Roptek was sure that the goblins in control of the camp would never suspect an attack. They had a good advantage and had to use it quickly before the goblins learned about them and their plans. All day they marched, covering as much distance as possible, directly towards the lands of the Mokhtar Mountain Goblin clan. On the way they met a column of soldiers marching towards the Colossus Mountains and the lands of the fairies. There were almost 200 in the column, mostly boys that looked like they had seen battle before. They were commanded by 6 goblins. They were far too many for Duncan and his small force to do anything against, without a big risk of losing everything, so they did not march too close, hoping to pass them by. But the larger column sent a small detachment of 1 goblin and 3 boys. They approached confidently, not expecting anything unusual. Duncan halted his group and, with Sam, Finn and Charlie, moved to meet the approaching enemy. Roptek took the lead, for that was what would be expected. Duncan felt nervous, both fearful that the enemy goblin would realize something was amiss, or that Roptek would betray them and make a bid for freedom. Duncan kept one hand firmly gripped on the sword at his hip. The other hand wore his ring, which he focused on, building energy in it in a way that he had been practicing as he marched, energy ready to be unleashed if things went wrong. Roptek greeted the goblin, and they introduced themselves by exchanging name and what clan they were from. The opposing goblin explained that they were heading to the Colossus Mountains, one of several groups being sent to secure a passage through the mountains, ready for Umkrar's armies to march through. Roptek nodded along before simply saying that they were heading east to resupply and get some fresh recruits. The other goblin gave a simple nod, and the boy he was sat atop turned around and strode away. The 2 other boys followed without thought. In that moment Duncan was strongly tempted to free the 3 boys and capture the goblin, but he knew it would likely spell doom for them all. Roptek suggested they all return to their own group. That was it. All it took was a few words from a goblin and no one questioned anything. Roptek had not betrayed them, had in fact saved them. Duncan breathed a slow sigh of relief as the 35 boys and 1 goblin resumed their march. But the large column of soldiers that were moving away already raised a question. When, or if, I managed to free the boys from the training camp, where do we go? He had already discussed it with Sam, and knew they didn't have a good idea. One thing at a time, Duncan, he told himself. They marched until dusk, and then slept. The next morning another column marched nearby, but this time they seemed in more of a rush and did not stop to talk. They marched again, but not so rushed today. Roptek told them that they were less than a day's march from the training camp and they had agreed to make camp near it, not wanting to arrive at the camp. They stopped marching in the late afternoon, less than an hour away from the training camp. They ate dinner and talked through potential plans. They had 2 goals. The first was to free the boys in the camp. The second objective was to find and capture Pelkar. It was believed by Roptek that he was the only mage goblin capable of the spell required to enslave a boy. He had never heard of another doing it. All the boys with Duncan had been enslaved by Pelkar, and all hated him with a passion. Indeed, most boys had ignored the discussion of capture and had vowed to kill him. Unlike them, Duncan had not been a soldier in inter-goblin wars for years, and was not used to the idea of killing goblins. Duncan sat concentrating. He needed to practice his magic. He had improved so much from his first attempts. Freeing Charlie had taken a long time, the best part of an hour, and had required Duncan's most intense concentration for the whole time. The last boy he had freed had taken just a few seconds of contact, and Duncan hadn't even had to think about it that much. He knew what to do now and how to do it, and it had just flowed. Now he sat, considering. Is there a better way to do it? Could I do it without even touching them? Like Charlie, Finn or Sam? If they had a ring like mine? Are there other rings like mine? So many questions, and no one to answer them. Duncan knew some of them could be asked of Roptek, but Duncan was still not completely sure if he could trust the goblin. It was really only Ben who trusted Roptek without question. So he sat and practiced what he could. He practiced holding different amounts of energy in his ring. Then he thought about the things he might be able to do. He had caused the ground to shake and split apart. He had caused a metal sword to reshape itself into a fine net of metal wire. He could also smash apart the magical prison that kept human minds enslaved. So his magic seemed to work against two things: minerals, like metal and rock, and other magic. Holding a small amount of energy in his ring, he placed his hand on the earth in front of him and thought about forming the flat ground into a small mound. Before, when he had manipulated the earth, it had been an undirected release of power, a chaotic burst. This time he was concentrating, and it was difficult. At first it didn't seem to achieve anything, but then he tried something different. Instead of trying to reshape the earth, he looked at the soil much more closely and found that he could feel individual rocks, pebbles, even grains of sand. More interestingly, he could feel forces holding them together, like threads in a web. As he looked further, he realized it was an immensely intricate web that extended as far as he could push his mind, and undoubtedly much further. Examining those threads, as he examined the magical prisons that held the minds of his friends, he poked at one, then another, then a handful, watching the way his manipulations moved the tiny particles of sand. I understand, he realized, knowing that he could indeed do what he wanted. Selecting a handful of threads in the ground before him, he pulled, twisted and pulled again, weaving them into a new shape. He realized that he had been working with his eyes closed, shaping it blind. He opened them to see that he had indeed reshaped the earth, but not into the mound he had originally intended. Beside his thumb, rising majestically from the ground, was a sword. He was further surprised to find that he had gained an audience, most of the boys of his small army as well as Roptek, watching him with expressions ranging from amazement to distrust. It's starting to crumble, said Finn quietly. Duncan looked back to his creation to see the sword, made of earth and sand, starting to lose its shape as grains of sand broke free. But he mentally tightened all the threads that held the shape together, and it snapped back into the shape of a sword, its edges looking sharper than ever. Curious what he could accomplish, Duncan moved his hand. Keeping in contact with the earth, he shifted his grip onto the hilt of the sword, which was still half buried. He gripped it and lifted. The rest of the hilt formed as he lifted it, and he felt the small web that held the sword together break free of the wider web of the earth on which he knelt. Duncan stood, holding a sword of mud and earth that he had created. He looked at it, pleased with how sharp it looked, even though it was just a plaything of sand. Or is it? He concentrated a little more, making the particles along that sharp edge a bit denser, finer and sharper. There was no visible sign he had done anything, but it felt like a weapon. He raised the weapon into a fighting position, towards Sam. On guard, he said to his friend, who obligingly drew his own weapon and held it out defensively. Duncan struck it, and the two weapons clashed, but lacked the sound of metal on metal. Duncan's sand sword worked just as well as a metal one, as their blades deflected one another 2 more times. Duncan saw a few wisps of long grass to one side, and swiped at one of them, slicing neatly through it, satisfying himself that it really was as sharp as it felt. Then he tried something new, more interesting and requiring a bit more concentration. This time, he swiped at a blade of grass, but concentrated on allowing the sand to flow around it. Everything seemed to go into slow motion, and he could feel each grain break free of the sword momentarily, as it avoided the grass. It worked. To everyone watching, it looked like his sword had passed through the grass. To the horror of his friends, Duncan then held out his free hand before him, and used his sword in a short chopping motion. His friends gasped and shouted things like, "Duncan, no!" or, "You've gone mad!" They were all left speechless as the blade seemed to pass straight through Duncan's hand, although Duncan knew that the reality was that the sand sword had moved around it, the grains gliding along his skin in a tingling way, as he had instructed the sword to avoid damaging human skin. Roptek was the only one that said anything.
This looks and feels like goblin magic, but not any sort of goblin magic that I have seen before. Like something else is blended in. Have you trained with the mage goblins?
He asked, a little suspiciously. Duncan just shook his head, amazed by his own magic.